You know what I could really get into? Clean underwear. Ha. But really, I did. In 2 words. Mack Weldon. They're known for their smart design, premium fabrics, and simple shopping, and they shipped right to my door. And they have a line that's antimicrobial and eliminates odor. Eliminates odor. If you don't like your first pair, keep it. They'll still refund you. Go to mackweldon.com and get 20% off your purchase. 20%, 1/5, 20, by using the promo code Fictional. The snow continued melting outside as Francis Thurston hefted the last of his great-uncle's boxes onto his desk. He was the executor of the man's estate and had been responsible for settling all his affairs after the poor old Professor Angell had died in an accident last fall. As he stared at the last worn box, he realized he needed some coffee. The fact that his great-nephew was the executor of his will should tell you just how few family members Angell had left. His funeral had been sparse, just a few work friends who agreed that it was a shame that such a brilliant man had gone in such a stupid accident. Professor Angell had been so brilliant, in fact, that Francis didn't understand most of the things in the remaining boxes. He delegated personal items in one place and gave the professor's professional papers and artifacts to his colleagues at Brown and various museums. There was one box that remained. It wasn't university stuff, but it clearly wasn't personal either. Francis looked at the wooden object, but couldn't find the lid. Of course. It was the last box within the last box of his uncle's stuff. Honestly, Francis hadn't even wanted to be the executor of the will. There was no sign-up for this sort of thing. It had fallen on him as last of kin, so here he was sifting through the man's property, despite being a great nephew of the professor, and never having talked to him once in his life. 15 minutes and another cup of coffee later, Francis still couldn't find any openings or seams on the mysterious box he'd found. He turned it over and over again, scanning every inch of the box, but again came up empty. It was just a big wooden cube. As he set it down where he'd found it, a small insignia, one that reminded him of something, caught his eye. Francis snapped his fingers and ran to a pile of personal effects, collected from the body of his uncle after he died. He rummaged a moment before locating it, a particular ring with the same design as the insignia in the box. It was a perfect match, and with a simple turn, the lid of the box clicked open and fell to the ground. Inside were a few thick file folders, full of papers and pictures, and an odd little clay relief. Francis emptied the box. It looked like any one of the countless other weird things his uncle had at work. Except the man had gone to great lengths to hide this. In fact, the main box had been hidden underneath a false bottom in one of the closets. That's why it was the last. The new owners of the townhouse had found it and contacted Francis. And not only was it hidden, it was sealed by a signet ring. Whatever was in the box was something that Professor Angell did not want to be found. Francis took the folders and began reading. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. Hours and hours later, Francis sat back, stunned. This was impossible. But his great uncle had believed it, pursued it. He had collected different details and summaries, but now he was dead. Angell had taken notes on everything. Every conversation he had had with some kid named Henry, every call to a colleague that yielded fruit, and even those that didn't. In addition to countless letters and clippings from the papers, Angell had left a journal of his own thoughts on the matter. Francis could see that his great-uncle had first rejected it as a farce, then a fairy tale, and then, as he connected more and more of the disparate stories, he'd grown more sober and more afraid. What had his uncle found? A death cult that stretched back as far as humanity itself? Ones that were still active today? Francis had to know more. He looked through everything and saw the last lead his uncle was following. Some kid named Henry. And by the look of it, he lived just right down the street. Might as well pay him a visit. Henry smiled. It was nice to meet the family of Professor Angell. Henry had considered him a friend, and it was just so shocking that he would die. It was right after he left Henry's parents' place, too. Henry's might have been the last face he saw. Francis looked on the young man. He didn't look much like Angell's notes. Angell had described Henry as an eccentric, an artist who was heavy on vision and light on hygiene. Everything Francis had read about him had painted him as dirty, anxious, and gifted. Yet, standing in his apartment, it was Spartan, bare, except for the necessities. The young man was different, too. He was well-dressed and affable. He said he wanted to be helpful, but the dreams, that thing, he hadn't seen them in months. It had just been a few nightmares, around the time of the earthquake last fall. Nothing more. Francis had no reason to think that there was any more to it. Did he? The polite and smiling young man had become colder. He was still smiling, but there was something behind his eyes. Something that made Francis lie. Francis just laughed it off. No, he actually didn't care about the dreams at all. His uncle was into a lot of weird stuff at work. Francis was just the executor of his will, so he was just stopping by anyone who had contact with the old professor to see if they had anything of his in their possession. He would take work home from the university and sometimes forget he had priceless artifacts. Henry relaxed. No, Angell had never given him anything other than his time, and someone to talk to during a difficult time in his life. Francis thanked the young man and told them that if anything came up, to let him know. Otherwise, good luck with the art thing. Francis wasn't oblivious, though he tried to walk like he was. He whistled to himself as he ambled down the street, and it wasn't until he turned the corner that he was able to exhale. He knew about Henry. He knew that the young man's eyes had been on him since the moment he left the apartment building, looking, probing for any sort of suspicion that Francis wasn't who he said he was, that he wasn't looking for what he said he was looking for. Francis, determined to give him nothing, held it together until he turned the corner, though after he did, his hand shook all the way home. He didn't return by way of the dock. Months passed, and though Francis tried to put the Cthulhu cult out of his mind, he kept returning, again and again, to the files, to the image. It was a rudimentary image, crafted by a talented man in his sleep, yet those eyes watched him. It towered above the island, the sunken city of Rillier, dead Cthulhu, the priest of the great old ones, standing over a city. As Francis looked out across the ocean, considering something so big that it could take up the sky, an inescapable, existential dread washed over him. He wanted to believe that it was nothing, a farce, a fairy tale, but his mind kept returning to it. Francis traveled south to Louisiana to meet with Inspector Legrasse, named in his great-uncle's files. He caught the man outside the station, just leaving after a shift. The old police officer sucked on his cigarette and ignored the archaeology professor until Francis blurted out that he wanted to talk about the statue. The inspector flicked away his cigarette. He turned slowly. "You one of them?" "Them?" Francis asked. "Them," Legrasse repeated. "If you are one, then you know what I mean. But if you aren't, and you know about the statue, then you know what I mean. If you don't know what I mean, then we have nothing to talk about." "The cultists," Francis replied. So it did go deeper. "The cultists," said Legrasse, lighting a fresh cigarette. "You don't look like them, anyway. They don't come up and say hi, either. I don't know how you got your hands on that report, but be careful. These people, the things they've done, I can still hear it, you know? The chants on the wind, the screams. Sometimes I think they're memories. Other times, I'm not so sure. I don't have anything else for you if you've read the report. I stay out of the swamplands now. But, Francis, is it? Watch out. This isn't a game to them. It's not about money or power or station. I hear their footsteps in the night. I see their eyes in the alleyways and from the trees. I hear that line whispered over and over. They will never stop. It's their god. They're fanatically devoted. They think it talks to them in their dreams. And if you've read the report, then you know what they can do. So just be careful. There's no reasoning with them, no talking. They think it will rise from the sea and bathe the earth in blood and terror. If you've made it this far, then they might already know your name. They've killed before, and I have no doubt that they'll kill again. Francis returned by train to New England, reflecting on Legras's words the entire time. Clearly the cult existed. Legras, beneath this hard-boiled facade, had been shaken by that night 20 years ago, and, on some level, believed old Castro. Francis returned to New England, and it finally happened. As in, nothing happened. He had come to the end of his knowledge on the Cthulhu cult. He spent the next week reading and rereading Professor Angell's notes with a steadily dwindling bottle of scotch, but without new information, no new dreams or clippings or leads, there was nothing he could do but close the file, pack it back into the box, and seal everything away. After another week, he started to come to his senses. After a month, he laughed at himself that he'd ever been so caught up with the idea of a cult that had secretly and violently existed since the dawn of humanity. He laughed at himself for ever taking a train to Louisiana. Who did he think he was? He was an archaeology professor. Not an archaeology professor who was also a world adventurer. I mean, what a ridiculous concept, right? At the end of a month, he had gotten it out of his system. Francis focused back on his work and friendships and stopped spending his nights poring over the fantastical research of some dead language professor. It was because he was out one evening at a friend's house that he, thumbing through some old newspapers while his friend was seeing some other guests out, stumbled upon one from Sydney, Australia. Francis took one look at the front page and dropped his glass. There, on the front page of the paper, was a crudely carved statue that Francis recognized immediately. The crouching form, the wings, the tentacles dangling from the face. It was unmistakably Cthulhu. His friend stood there yelling at him about the fallen drink. Something about the floor and what's wrong with you, but Francis didn't hear it. He devoured the article faster than he had read anything in his entire life. It told the story of some derelict vessel that had been found at sea with only one survivor. It told the story of Captain Johansen. The boat rocked beneath Francis as the man packed up and prepared to make landfall in Australia. It had been a long 6 weeks. The paper just treated Johansen like a madman. Someone rambling about an island, about a monster. Most would ignore it, but Francis couldn't. After months of nothing, and then to see the carving on the front page, one that looked exactly like that of the cultists in Louisiana, Francis cursed himself. This wasn't over. Here was something new. Here was a man who had potentially been to the island, been to Relais. By the very fact that he had talked to the paper, he wasn't a cultist. This would be a nightmare for them. No, he was a survivor, and Francis had to find him while he was still alive. It took a train to San Francisco and a month-long boat trip to Australia for him to reach Johansen's country. And when he finally made it to Australia, there was nothing. Though Francis thought that one of his fellow sailors would love a chance to talk about how one of their own had bravely faced the sea and won, no one was excited to talk about Johansen. The ones that knew of him wanted their conversations with Francis to be finished as quickly as possible, and there were others who were less helpful. Francis spent less and less time around the docks, as he remembered Legrasse's warning, and saw more and more eyes interested in who he was talking to. Francis saw Johansen's ship, the Alert. It had been sold and rehabbed for use by a shipping company. He also saw the statuette, though he couldn't bear to be around it for too long. Where that image went, death followed. The people who studied it said it was made from no known earthly substance. Francis shuddered, remembering what old Castor had said about the great old ones in the report. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. Finally, one of Johansen's old friends came forward. Quietly, he warned that it wasn't wise to ask too many questions about Johansen anymore. There were too many people interested in that name. It was with reluctance that he told Francis that Johansen had left. He had gone back to his native Norway. After what had happened at sea, Johansen was a different person. I mean, anyone would be. But he couldn't bear to remain in Australia. All of his friends were dead. And he kept talking about the eyes that followed him everywhere. His friend thought he was losing it a little after what had happened. But in the months since Johansen had left, his friend had noticed them too. Maybe Johansen wasn't crazy. He was paranoid, sure, but maybe he had a reason to be. So Johansen and his wife returned to Norway, their home. Hopefully there, he could finally move on and maybe heal. Later that day, sitting in his room, Francis knew that he had only one option. He packed his bags one last time and boarded the next ship for Europe. We'll learn what Francis finds when he finishes nearly circumnavigating the globe, but that will be right after this. Casper's a sleep brand that continues to revolutionize a line of products to create an exceptionally comfortable sleep experience, one night at a time. You spend a third of your life sleeping, so you should be comfortable. Casper's breathable design helps you sleep cool and regulates your body temperature throughout the night. And it's delivered right to your door with a small, how do they do that, size box, with free shipping and returns to the US and Canada. You can be sure of your purchase with Casper's 100-night, risk-free sleep-on-it trial. And with 3 models, the original Casper, the Wave, and the Essential, Casper mattresses are perfectly designed to soothe and cradle your natural geometry. Well, that just sounds amazing. And you know what? It is. I have one and I sleep better. My wife sleeps better. Heck, even if you have nightmares about Cthulhu, you'd sleep well on this mattress. Not that I've had those dreams. Or have I? I haven't. But would I tell you if I did? Anyway, start sleeping ahead of the curve with Casper. Get $50 towards any mattress purchase by visiting casper.com/fictional and using fictional at checkout. That's casper.com/fictional. Offer code fictional for $50 off of your mattress purchase. Terms and conditions apply. You know what breathlessly researching a violent cult that's existed since the dawn of humanity leaves very little time for? Grocery shopping. But that's okay, because HelloFresh shopped, planned, and delivered step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients right to me. With HelloFresh, all the ingredients come right to your door in recyclable, insulated packaging, pre-measured and handy labeled meal kits, so you know which ingredients go with which recipe. Plus, HelloFresh offers a wide variety of chef-curated recipes that change weekly, whether it's the classic plan with meat, fish, and seasonal produce, the veggie plan, vegetarian recipes with plant-based proteins, or even the family plan, with quick and easy meals the whole family will love. And you can choose the delivery day that works best for you and pause your account for weeks at a time. HelloFresh makes it so easy to cook delicious, balanced dinners for less than $10 a meal. No more time-consuming meal planning and grocery shopping, no spending money on takeout for an easy night, or worrying about gathering ingredients week after week. HelloFresh is my favorite meal delivery service. It's balanced, satisfying, and really convenient, like that pork luau burger we had last week. Delicious. For $30 off your first week of HelloFresh, visit HelloFresh.com and enter the promo code Fictional30. That's Fictional30. Weeks upon weeks later, Francis stood shivering outside Johansen's residence on the outskirts of Oslo. He paused before knocking. He was crazy. Still, if Johansen had been to the island, if he had seen Cthulhu, how could Francis not talk to him? His heart beating with the excitement at this, the final stage of his journey, Francis knocked on the door. He heard a rustling from within, before a middle-aged woman answered. She was both weary and wary, but seeing that Francis seemed nice, and after hearing he had come to Norway from North America by way of Australia, trying to figure out what had happened to Captain Johansen at sea, she let Francis enter. Once settled, Francis said he had just a few questions for the captain. Could he speak to him? Mrs. Johansen said that Francis could ask the captain anything he wanted, though the captain wasn't much for speaking these days. She motioned to the urn on the shelf. Francis sighed and offered Mrs. Johansen his condolences. She thanked him. She confided that, after the incident, Captain Johansen was never the same. She would wake him up at night, amid his shaking or weeping or screaming. When he returned from the ordeal, his blonde hair had turned white, and at least half of his mind always seemed to be on the island. Francis followed that line of thought, seeing if Mrs. Johansen knew anything about the island, but she said the captain never spoke of it. He did, however, try writing things down after his return. She handed Francis a nearly new diary, one with only a few pages written in it. She told Francis that he could keep it. Johansen obviously wanted to keep her from whatever had happened on the island, so she hadn't read it, and she never would. Mrs. Johansen apologized that she didn't have more information, but was glad that someone had come searching for the truth. So many had called him crazy. Francis was the only one who had come. The couple had no friends left in Oslo, so it had been a quiet funeral. She sighed as she turned to look at the urn. At least he was at peace now. There was something that Francis was wondering since he saw the urn, and knew as he walked to the door that this was his last chance to ask it. He passed over the threshold of the doorway and back out into the snow. He turned around and, apologizing for being indelicate, asked how it had happened. How had Captain Johansen died? A sad smile appeared on Mrs. Johansen's face. After all he had been through, after so many years at sea and losing all of his friends, it had been some stupid accident. He slipped on a walk home from town, it seemed, and tumbled down into the icy sea. He must have hit the rocks hard, because his face was mangled and his arms broken. It seemed that, after the fall, he was either unconscious or unable to pull himself up. He drowned in a foot of water, not 100 yards down the road. Professor Angell's casket flashed in Francis's mind. The eyes of the sailors in Australia. Maybe Professor Angell's death hadn't been an accident. Maybe those sailors that had run down after him hadn't been trying to save him. He snapped back to reality and said a half-hearted goodbye to Mrs. Johansen, who was now in tears. He saw the door close, heard the lock click, and turned to face the long, dark walk back to the city. It was a comparatively short trip home, just an early 20th century boat ride across the Atlantic, as opposed to a boat ride across the rest of the world. Francis thought about Johansen the entire way home. He did, however, wait until he was in the safety of his private office to finally open the diary. Something about reading a first-hand account of a pirate attack and a shipwreck that killed 8 people didn't sit well on a trip across the ocean. The first few pages were a slow start. He obviously wasn't used to writing, or perhaps he didn't want to remember. It wasn't an easy read, but Francis understood it well enough. The place had a malaise about it. A disease. Captain Johansen should have known from the moment they saw it how it would end. They saw it miles before the rest of the island. a monolith, a large rectangular pillar stretching into the sky. There was talk among the men on the alert that nothing could be that big. Nothing made by humans, at least. As they churned closer to the structure, the sky began to grow dark. But not by clouds or nightfall. No, this was different. The thing at the center seemed to suck all light and life from the world around it. The man behind Johansen turned and vomited, and as they sailed closer, Johansen saw why. The shapes, they didn't make sense. The geometry of the place was just all wrong. Flat surfaces curved. Right angles were also obtuse. You could climb a ladder on a tower to its own base. It hurt your mind to look at it for too long. Johansen had the feeling that they should turn back. But the crew of the Alert stood in awe of the spires that rose from the ocean before them, and made no motion to turn around. Their ship continued on until the deck began to rumble, and a scraping sound filled the air. The crewmen took a step back, steadying themselves as the ship bumped abruptly into something below. Once, then again, a jagged point got the edge of the bow, and it slowed to a halt on a flat surface. The sea stood still as a corpse all around them. Johansen peered cautiously down into the dark, clear waters, and realized that they weren't approaching the edge of an island. They were on a mountaintop. A vast, ancient city stretched deep into the darkness below. Only the very top of the island had emerged from the ocean, and even that stretched high into the sky. He stared down into the submerged spires of the city of Rillier, all still sleeping, and a crushing dread swept over him. Instantly, he looked up and announced that they had to turn back. There was nothing for them here, and they would take their chances on the open ocean back to Sydney. But the men were nearly gone. They were piling off the Alert and into a rowboat to explore this vast and sickening place. The rotten slime of untold eons spent underwater overwhelmed this place, like the darkness of it overwhelmed the sun and the sky. Even the feel of it was wrong. Surfaces were hard and soft, slippery and sticky. One moment you were walking on a flat surface, and the next you were looking up to see your companions on a path walking sideways up in the air, neither group knowing who was actually walking on the ground. That was probably how they made it so quickly to the monolith. This place was dead, and the citadel was nothing more than a hollowed-out husk of a building. There was no food, no riches on this island. No one knew why the former crew of the Alert had attacked them, or what they were defending. But if there was an answer to this place, it lied with the monolith in the center of the island. It was an impossibly tall, unfathomably wide column, so large that when they walked up to it, it filled their sight in every direction. Close up, it was obvious that it was more than a stone structure. It had hinges. Everyone stood in silent awe until a sailor reached out and decided to touch the door. They could have never known what touching it would do, what they would awaken. But as soon as the man's fingertips grazed the monolith, the deeply cut hieroglyphics began to glow faintly. So faintly that the sailors didn't even notice it until the symbols had begun to radiate with that same sickly green tint that overwhelmed the sun. And the hinges of the monolith began screeching as stone from eons of disuse fell away. In the time that the city of Rillier was above water, the stars had been right. The ones that had brought the great old ones here, that had given them the earth. It had been hundreds of billions of years. But the stars were right. And all it took was the touch of a worshiper or an unwitting interloper to call the old ones back to life. Now, the door was opening, and the great old ones would live again. The men stood, frozen before the palpable darkness. When the doors thudded to a rest, echoing across the expanse of ocean, the men were hit with another sensation. The smell. The stagnant smell of death emanated from the monolith. It was a smell of corpses. As the men were staring into the impossibly large darkness, the darkness stared back at them. It was almost too far up for them to see. Two red, glowing eyes opened for the first time in eons. Johansen's second in command was the first one to notice them. He glanced upward and met the eyes of Cthulhu, the priest of the Great Old Ones. Seeing those eyes staring back at him, seeing the size, the power of the thing, it was too much. He screamed and collapsed. In his eyes, he could see the hate, the fury, the desire to bathe the earth in madness and blood, and the power to do so. His scream alerted the others, and they all craned upward to see the face. As Cthulhu's head emerged from the shadows, the light of the sun once again touching its tentacled mouth and scaled, ageless body, the sailors were frozen. Their minds screamed at them to run, while the thing took one lurching step forward. Johansen and two others listened. They did the one thing you can do when facing a behemoth god of old. They ran. Johansen, his mind flooding with terror, ran as fast as he could. He didn't see that the geometry of the place swallowed up one of his men. He didn't feel the slickness of the slime-coated walkways that turned over onto themselves. He just ran. He pushed his way through the citadel and slid down the mountain. He dove into the rowboat and rowed the short way back to the boat alone. He splashed over the submerged rooftops of the cursed city and clawed at the boat, pulling himself aboard and running to the wheel. He started the steam running and dared to look back at the monolith. 5 of his men were still frozen before the thing, in awe or fear, when Cthulhu took one step and crushed them without a thought. The thing emerged from the chamber where it had spent countless years and breathed deep of the air of Earth. As he stared up to the sky, even the sun darkened in his presence. Its head among the clouds, Johansen watched the eyes search the horizon before they met Johansen's. The captain shuddered, pushing back at the madness. He didn't care if the boat was ready to leave yet. He was leaving. He put as much power as he could muster into moving back and pushing away from the top of the spire. Just over the scraping, he could hear another, the voice of one of his men, screaming for him to wait. He looked over and saw one of his men swimming to the boat. Johansen shook his head. That thing was still staring, still studying them. There was no way he was going to stop now. Luckily, for the other guy at least, the spire took longer to scrape free than Johansen thought. By the time he felt the last of it, he heard a thud as the man threw himself over the edge and onto the boat. He didn't berate his captain. He didn't scream. He didn't do anything but laugh. The look of Cthulhu emerging from his crypt had driven the man to madness. Johansen saw Aurelier shake with each step as the thing, laser-focused, lurched toward the ship. In a few steps, it was to the edge of the water. That was when Johansen watched it fan out its wings and drop. He put it to full steam. He knew what would happen next. They had to get clear. Something that big hitting the water would send a wave big enough to topple the boat. And if that didn't happen, they could be sucked under. They had to get free. Smoke poured from the stack as the alert nearly came apart. A swell rose, and Johansen shook his head. He took his belt and lashed himself to the wheel. He pushed the alert harder and harder, but it wasn't up to full steam yet. It would take more power. They would need more time. The wave hit, and it nearly toppled the boat. Johansen didn't know what happened to the other guy, but seeing as he would have been thrown overboard if he wasn't tied to the boat, it did not bode well for his laughing companion. Johansen pushed on, gaining more and more speed. When he saw that it passed, and that they had managed to survive the wave and outrun being sucked under, it looked like the alert had done it. That was when he saw the eyes. In the water behind him, he saw the same red eyes that he had seen inside the monolith. They were rising from the darkness of the deep. There would be no escape. It was then, staring his death in the face, that Johansen had an impossible, audacious thought. No. Though everything screamed out at him to run, he shook his head. He was going to die. This thing would kill him, like it had killed the others. But Johansen wouldn't run. He would fight like he hoped every other human would fight against this thing when it made landfall. He would show this thing, this twisted god, what it was in for. He would show it that humanity would not go easily. He turned the boat around and saw Cthulhu rising from the water, the top of its head looming like a planet. Johansen looked down. Couldn't help but chuckle. Now he was at full steam. Okay. He jammed the throttle down just as the red eyes started to rise from the sea. When Cthulhu's head filled his vision and the scales were all he could see, he looped the bout around his wrist tighter and braced for impact. He didn't see the boat tearing into the slimy, scaly forehead of the great old one because he was too busy having his arm dislocated. He absolutely heard what happened next. Cthulhu let loose a wail that caused the captain to double over. It blasted away the last bit of sanity he still clung to. He didn't see the head drop back down into the water, putrid liquid flowing from the gash the alert had made. With his last bit of energy, as he lost consciousness, he spun the wheel to take the alert away from the island. Then he collapsed. A week later, the alert was found drifting listlessly, with Johansen still lashed to the wheel and with a smiling dead man below deck. Francis closed the book and rested it in the small, strange lockbox he had inherited from his great uncle, the one that had changed his life. He glanced at the dates in Johansen's journal and nodded. The day that the stars were right. The day that Cthulhu had emerged from his sleep. That was the same day that Henry started having his dreams. Francis had a letter, when he returned, sitting on his desk. It was very discreet. From the captain of the ship that had rescued Johansen. He didn't want to talk to Francis in person when he was on Australia, but he wanted to tell him that they took Johansen seriously, and they had returned to the spot where Johansen said he had seen the island. Except that now, there was nothing there but open ocean. Francis couldn't explain it, other than that the stars were right for only an instant. Cthulhu must have needed to return to Relais before it sank once again into the sea. The hit from the boat must have just been coincidental. There was no way Cthulhu could be free on the face of the earth without the deaths of millions following it. They were safe. For now. But the old one still slumbered under the vast, dark ocean, still speaking to those of us that would listen. A cult that existed before the dawn of humanity still lurked in the shadows of every country, every city. Nearly everyone who knew anything about the Cthulhu mythos was now dead. And Francis looked down at the box with a chill. This weekend he would take the box and burn it. That way, no one would learn about the Cthulhu cult again until the old ones rose from the sea to take back their world. Francis could only pray that it didn't happen in his lifetime. He stood up to go home and looked again at the box. He had another thought, one that he tried to dismiss, but couldn't. It gnawed at him as he tried to leave. He was halfway out the door before he turned round and finally gave into it. He scribbled out a note and placed it on top of the box. He placed the box in the top drawer and left. The note was as simple as it was direct. It was an amendment, of sorts, to his will. He told the executor of his estate not to read the contents of the box, and to make sure that no one else did, by any means necessary. It was pointless, of course. He was going to destroy it himself this weekend, but, as ridiculous as it was, if he didn't survive until the weekend, at least his heirs would know what to do with it. At least they wouldn't read it. At least they wouldn't put their lives in danger. As Francis looked out at the darkened shoreline, he was overwhelmed with despair. This earth didn't belong to them, and the old ones would return someday. There was no stopping it. Terrors lurked in the depths of this world that we couldn't possibly understand. As he was consumed by this thought, he didn't see the eyes watching him from the alleyway and down the street. And as Francis walked home in the early darkness of winter, he didn't see those very same people emerge from the alleys and homes to follow him into the night. And resounding in the darkness were those same whispers that so many had heard before their deaths. In his house in Rilliers, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The story was an adaptation of the short story The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I say adaptation because if you've read the original, you'll know that it's structured very, very differently. I basically unpacked the different pieces and presented them as an interwoven narrative, as opposed to reading about someone who is reading about something happening. Francis Thurston, in the actual story, is the only really active character, and the whole story is about him reading his uncle's notes, and yeah, we know from the outset that both he and Professor Angell are dead. Anyway, if you want to read the actual story, I posted it in its entirety at fictional.fm. Now, it's time for the best of the worst. The villain this time is Mr. Roy G. Bavolo from DC Comics, and I will give you one guess as to what his power relates to. All right, time's up. Roy G. Bavolo's supervillain name is the Rainbow Raider because, well, he rides rainbows. Roy had a rough childhood. Well, not Batman rough. His tragic backstory was that he was colorblind, and that conflicted with his one true love in life, creating and admiring works of art. He was a decent painter, too, but people would take one look at the color of his works and laugh in his face. Roy's dad, Dr. Bavolo, an optometrist, saw his son's pain and wanted to help. He spent long hours and nights and weekends in his lab, working on goggles for his son to finally see all the colors of the rainbow. Unfortunately, Dr. Bavolo came down with a terminal illness, and his goggles would never be completed. He told his son about them right before he died, but also informed him of his failure. Roy would never be able to see color. All these stupid goggles could do was create a solid beam of rainbow-colored light you could walk or ride on. Yeah, a landmark discovery in and of itself, but his son would never be a painter, so it was all for nothing. As his father passed, Roy G. Bavolo held the goggles in his hand. He could have been inspired by his father's love and effort to continue his work to make the world a better place. Or life of crime? Life of crime. In between, presumably, constructing racetracks for Mario Kart, the Rainbow Raider robbed art museums. Because if he couldn't fully appreciate works of art, then no one else should be able to either. In addition to awesome rainbow slides, the Rainbow Raider also has the ability to coat people in different types of light, affecting their mood. For example, coating them in blue light would, yes, make them blue. That's actually how he first arrived on the scene. He was walking into an art museum after hours and blasted the guards with his blue light. The next thing they know, they're on the floor holding each other and having a good cry. He blasted the Flash with his black light. It was literally black light, and not the type you never want to use in a hotel room. And it sapped all of Flash's energy, turning him Morlock white. He got it back when he vibrated to the exact wavelength of the colors, or some other very scientific 1980s comic book explanation, and just grabbed the glasses off of the Rainbow Rider's face. If you're worried about how it all ended, don't be, because there is absolutely an end to the rainbow pun. For someone as non-threatening as the Rainbow Raider, he's had a brutal, art-related death twice. In fact, after the DC universe was rebooted a few years back, Roy was rebooted too, with a much better name, Chroma. Unfortunately, all the rebranding in the world couldn't save him from a talking, super intelligent evil gorilla army. He ended up as their artwork when they tore his head off and put it on a stake outside their lair. That's it for this time. Today's episode was written by me, Jason Weiser, and edited and produced by Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by the amazing Breakmaster Cylinder. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. We all use underwear, right? Go for smart design, premium fabrics, and simple shopping with Mack Weldon. Look great, feel great, smell great. Order new underwear in your underwear. And if you don't like your first pair, keep it. They'll still refund you. Go to MackWeldon.com